For the last 4 weeks, we have been looking at the first 4 commandments of the 10 commandments. First one, there is only one God. The second commandment, don't make any images of him, or any images at all for that matter. The third commandment, don't use his name flippantly or vainly. The fourth commandment, set aside time to rest in God. We've been looking at those 4 things for the last 4 weeks. And as we look at all of those commandments, so far we need to recognize that we've been dealing with our vertical relationship, our relationship with God the Father. All of these things deal with us looking up to or looking to God. The first 4 commandments really have in mind us making a priority out of our relationship with God. Now that makes perfect sense, because if you remember, Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment? What is the greatest commandment? Now he actually gave 2 commandments, but if you think about the first thing he said, the first commandment that he said is, love the Lord your God completely. He says, love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Jesus says you need to make a priority out of your relationship with God. So that is what we've been doing for the last 4 weeks. Jesus, however, goes on and says the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, or love others too. Well, if you look at the last 5 commandments, they all deal with relationship with others. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie. All those things, they deal with our relationship with one another. But today we're going to look at the 5th commandment. I'm going to read it to you here in just a second. If you have your Bible, you can turn with me to Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. But this commandment we'll put on the screen. The scripture will be up on the screen here for you here in just a second. But I want to ask you, as we read this commandment, which category does this fall in? Does this fall into our relationship with God, or does this fall into our relationship with one another? This is what it says. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Honor your parents. Now, we would automatically think that's about loving others. That's not about loving God. That's about loving others. So reasonably, you should put this commandment in the second category of commandments, that which deals with loving other people. Not loving God, but loving other people. But I want to fill you in on something. That is not how the Jewish people saw this commandment. They would argue that your family is your very first introduction to God. In fact, before you even knew who God was, you experienced his qualities through your parents. Even though your parents are flawed, you should have experienced some of the qualities of God through your parents. For instance, you were created by your parents. You're completely dependent on your parents, at least were, under the authority of your parents. And the Jews would say that the family was a microcosm of how we should relate to God. In fact, they would say that this commandment should be in the first category, because in this commandment we would understand more about who God is, because we would understand more about who our parents are. See, this commandment is somewhat unique, because this commandment actually fits into both categories, loving God and loving others. Now, I would lean toward putting this command, to be quite honest, in the second category, loving others. But I can see their point. When you love your parents, when you honor your parents, when you understand who your parents really are, you get a better glimpse of who God is. At least you should. Now, all that being said, I just want to be very honest with you. This commandment, even though it appears to be quite straightforward, is very hard to address. Because as soon as you hear honor your father and mother, there are many who start bristling at that. They start bowing up. They start listing off all these things in their mind, reasons why they shouldn't have to honor their parents. Some people become very defensive. Some of them for very legitimate reasons. Maybe both their parents weren't around. Maybe neither of their parents were around. Maybe their parents were abusive in one way or another. Maybe they just didn't really care about them at all. As flawed as your parents may have been, God still commands, honor them. And so I'm asking you this morning, as we address this commandment, I'm asking you to trust God, that He knows what's best. And I'm asking you to just do what He says. Even if it's extremely hard, try to just be open to God's leading and do what He says. And hopefully, by the time we end the journey of this sermon, you will see that it is important that you do. You will understand why. So today, really all I want to do with this fifth command is ask some questions of it. So we're going to ask questions of this fifth command, and here's the first one. Who are we to honor? Now you're thinking to yourself, it's pretty straightforward, Todd. Surely you just say you honor your parents. The Bible's clear about it. Honor your parents. I would agree. It's very clear here. We are supposed to honor our father and our mother. Now I want you to understand something about that. That word "and" is very, very important. I don't know if you remember this. A few years back, Coca-Cola, or Coke Zero actually, came out with some commercials, and the commercials were all focused on this idea that it was 0 calories and great taste. If you remember, one of the commercials goes by, and this little boy gets a vanilla ice cream cone, and when they're getting ready to hand it to him, and he says, and all of a sudden, the man preparing his ice cream cone brings it back over, fills it with sprinkles, puts a cherry on top, and hands it back to him. In the same commercial, you see a dog on a skateboard, and the same young man says, and then all of a sudden the dog starts doing tricks in a skateboard park, doing all these amazing things. This same young man, when he gets older, he gets a new job. And when they offer him the new job, he says, and all of a sudden they give him stock options, and he winds up, they show all these scenes of him being filthy rich, and the advertisers are making sure that we understand just how important the word "and" is. 0 calories and great taste. That is what sells their product. If you only have one of them, it surely fails. In fact, other advertisers have picked up on this same idea, and they started showing what happens when you only have one of the things that are important in their advertising. For instance, Ford just put out a commercial not too long ago where they are telling you that they will give you all these benefits. You don't want to have to choose just one. In fact, they show the commercial, and there's this couple, and they're sitting down at this Chinese restaurant, and they get ready to eat, and they eat their chicken, and as you put the chicken in their mouth, they have these distorted faces, and you can tell that it is awful, and they say, "What is this?" And the waiter says, "Well, that's sour chicken." Now, it wasn't sweet and sour chicken, it was just the sour part of the chicken, and it was disgusting, and you could see what their point is. Their point is, even though they may not have understood it, their point is that "and" is important. In fact, it's the same point that God made a millennium, many millenniums before they were even born. There is an expectation with the word "and." God here tells us that we must honor our father and our mother. Not just choose one. Not decide who is your favorite. Honor them both. In God saying honor both your dad and your mom, God was saying something that in Moses' day was earth-shaking. Dad was the only one who had any value in the culture. Moms were very rarely mentioned at all. And so when God says this, He is pretty much destroying their entire thought pattern about how they should honor their parents. He's saying you must honor them equally. You must respect your dad and your mom equally. God is making it clear that family works best when both father and mother are respected as a team. The question is, have we really honored both mom and dad? When I was a boy, I remember being at home, and this happened all the time, to be quite honest. I hate to admit it, but it happened all the time. I was always getting in trouble. Now, my dad would work, And he'd come home, but my mom was there raising us 3 boys at home. And I remember this like it was yesterday. Mom would scold us or spank us, and me, being who I am, would kind of smirk or laugh at that. And then Mom said what many moms have had to say in our day: you just wait until your dad gets home. Now that brought a little bit of fear to my life because I knew what that meant. But the truth is, if your mom tells you wait till your dad gets home, then you are breaking the 5th commandment. Because you are not honoring your mom like you honor your dad. One is getting more honor than the other. One is getting more respect than the other. And so God starts off this commandment by saying, honor both your mom and your dad. It's not optional. They are both important. They are both over top of you in the realm of the hierarchy of a family. So who do we honor? We honor both father and mother. The second question we need to ask of this text is, why are we to honor? Why is it so important to do this honoring? Now, God tells us in this text, He says, so that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. However, if you go to Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, it's elaborated on a little bit. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 and 3. This is what Paul says. He says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, with a promise. And then he tells you what the promise is. He says this, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on earth. Now, the point of why honor your parents is because it makes life better. It benefits you to honor your parents. God says, if you will just honor me by honoring your parents, it will be healthier for you. Your life will be better. You will get to enjoy it longer. Now, this makes complete sense to me. Does it not make sense to you? At my house, when my kids were little, their lives were a whole lot healthier if they honored me, if they obeyed what I had to say. Their lives were a whole lot healthier. In fact, there were many times I thought to myself, I am going to shorten their life because they're not listening to me. And God essentially says, honor your parents because you're going to benefit from it. It is going to bring benefit to your life. The truth is, if we as parents will follow God, will follow Him with our lives, if we will lead our kids in that same pursuit of following God, then not only are their lives better, but our lives are better. And everyone benefits. So often we walk through life asking this question, what is best for me? What is best for me? And then we do those things and we find out that they really weren't the best things for us. What we really should be asking ourselves is, what would honor God? Because whatever you do, if it honors God, it will be what's best for you. It'll always be what's best for you. If you ask yourself, what would honor God here? That will be what's best for you. And God is saying, if you will honor your parents, that is what will be the best life you could live. You will benefit because you have honored your parents. God promises us here that if we live our lives honoring our parents, it will be a better one. It'll be a greater existence than if we live our lives not honoring them. So we've talked about who we should honor. We've talked about why we should honor them. And then we get to the point where the rubber hits the road. And the question we have to ask is, so how are we to honor? What does honor really look like? Now, in our text, God simply says this, honor. Honor your father and your mother. He just uses the one word, honor. He really doesn't define it. But that doesn't mean that He hasn't defined it elsewhere. That doesn't mean that He doesn't tell us throughout His letter to us what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to honor our parents. For instance, back to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, right at the beginning, this is what it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for that is right. I would submit to you that honor starts with obeying our parents. Honor means we listen to them and do what they ask. Honor has to do with an obedience that shows respect for what they're saying. And so, right off the bat, we see, according to Paul, that honor has to do with obedience. Obedience. That means, for instance, if you're getting up and you're heading out to school one day and your mom or your dad says, well, I don't like that shirt, that's inappropriate, or you need to put more clothes on, and you put more clothes on until you get to the bus, and then you take them off to what you were originally in, that's not honoring. I mean, essentially you did what they said, kind of, but you knew that's not what they meant, and you didn't really obey them. We need to be cautious that we obey our parents. God speaks about honor elsewhere. For instance, in Proverbs chapter 23, verses 24 and verse 25, it says, the father of a righteous man has great joy. He who has a wise son delights in him. May your father and mother be glad. May she who gave you birth rejoice. We honor our parents by living righteous lives. Now, righteousness is not a hard word to understand. Righteousness just simply means living in a right relationship with God, living in the right way toward God, with God, for God. It's living your life the way God wants you to live it. And when you do that, you honor your parents. You honor your parents. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5, the very last part of that verse, it says, talking about love, it says it keeps no record of wrong. And you may argue with me and say, well, this really isn't talking about parents, and I would say you're right. This is talking about the way in which we're supposed to love anybody. But I want you to understand this applies to our parents. We need to honor them by loving them enough to offer them grace and offer them forgiveness. I want you to understand something this morning. There are no perfect parents. There are no perfect parents besides God. There are no perfect parents. Every parent is going to make mistakes. They're going to mess up. They're going to say things or do things that they wish they could take back. All of us fail as parents. But we need to honor our parents by showing them love, offering them grace, and giving them forgiveness. Even if they've messed up. Even if they've messed up royally. We need to do those things. I want you to understand, however, that our honor does not stop when we leave the house. When we move out on our own, we're still supposed to honor them throughout our entire lives. And again, I want to look at a text that does not just apply to parents, but it does apply, in my opinion. It's Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Philippians 2, verse 3 says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. I just want you to understand we honor our parents by caring for their needs, for understanding that later in life they may have to depend on us to some degree, by realizing that it's not about us, it's about what's best for them. One of Grimm's fairy tales tells of an old man who lived with his son's wife, and their young son who was 4 years old. The old man's eyes blinked and his hands shook, and so when they sat down to eat, the silverware rattled against the plate, and he often missed his mouth, and the food would dribble onto the tablecloth. But this upset this young mother because she didn't want to have to deal with all the extra mess. She didn't want to have to deal with the hassle of taking care of this old man. But he had nowhere else to live. So these young parents decided to move him away from the table into a corner where he could sit on a stool and eat from a bowl. So he did. Always looking toward the table, wanting to be with his family, but having to sit alone in a corner. One day his hands trembled more than they usually did, and he dropped his bowl and it broke. If you are a pig, they said, then you must eat out of a trough. So they made the old man a wooden trough and put his meals in it. Not long after, the couple came upon their 4-year-old playing with some scraps of wood. His father asked him, "What are you doing, son?" And the little boy looked up at him and smiled and said, "I'm making a trough to feed you and Mama out of when I get big." The next day, the old man was back at the table eating with the family from a plate, and no one ever scolded him or mistreated him again. We honor our parents by recognizing that their needs at some point in life may become more important than our needs. As children, we always think our needs are most important, but we need to recognize that there's a time when their needs will be more important than our own. See, God calls us through the 10 Commandments to live a better life. That's what they are. There are steps to living a better life. I mean, they're a covenant with Him, but if you live them, you live a better life. But that better life doesn't stop in the Old Testament with the 10 Commandments. That better life is what He offers to all of us through Jesus Christ. In fact, Scripture says that Jesus came to give us life to the full, or abundant life. One of the steps to that abundant life is honoring our parents. God calls us to honor Him as Abba Father by honoring our earthly mother and father. If we do, He is glorified. And if we do, we are blessed. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you.